everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Our next council meeting is the AWP. The mission of our AWP council is to promote safety awareness through a more informed access industry. This council will champion the specific needs and requirements for all its stakeholders, including manufacturers, dealers, distributors, owners, employers, users, operators, regulators, and educators. This council is chaired by Forrest Hester of Tudis LLC and co-chaired by Jeff Stahoviak of Sunbelt Rentals. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Forrest Hester.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for joining us today on the AWP and MEWP Council here with the SAIA. Hope that everybody's been in good health and been able to stay energetic in this very unique time that we find ourselves. So just a little more in depth on the introduction. I've been the chair here with the AWP and MEWP for 3 years now. Also provide some volunteer efforts towards the ANSI committees, and most recently have started to get involved with the U.S. TAG. Our co-chair, who's not able to join us today because of prior commitments, is Mr. Jeff Stahoviak. He is the National Safety Training Director of Sunbelt Rentals since 2000. He's been in the equipment rental business since 1986. He's a member of the ANSI SAI A92 AWPs, MEWPs. He sits also on the ANSI ITSDF B56.6 for rough terrain forklift trucks, as well as the ISO TC 214 for MEWP controls, TC 110 for rough terrain fork trucks, and past Vice President of the Scaffold and Access Industry Association. And I know that he wishes that he could be here with us today. So before we dig into some of the work items, I just wanted to remind some of our possibly new attendees on really what the goals of the AWP and MEWP Council are, so that we can always work towards those goals and in achieving them. Goal number one is always to openly discuss issues that impact the AWP as a whole, then define initiatives to bring about a resolution. Goal number two is to pursue a leadership role regarding subjects that will ultimately benefit the entire industry by elevating awareness on elements that may have been previously sheltered. Our third goal is to strengthen the participation with the AWP Council by actively seeking participation, then recruiting new membership from all entities with a focus on users of AWP equipment. Emphasis on users. Goal number four, participate in the action items that are reflected in the SAI OSHA Alliance, in particular those that are associated with the best practices regarding AWP training and fall protection. And with that, goal number four is really what today is all going to be about. And I will share my screen so everybody can follow along with me. How is the font if we have some people with their mic still turned on? Is everybody able to read this pretty well?
Yes.
I can read it clear.
Yeah, looks good.
Very good. So this was brought to the council about a year and a half ago. It was discussed 2 years ago. And, we began kind of more in a discussion format on how to proceed and really started to bring it more to a working group at the October meeting. And so what I'd like to present and open up an opportunity for questions and to, be able to really make sure that anybody that desires to volunteer on this effort understands how to fill out the form, where they can find their resources. If you're not used to navigating the OSHA website, if you're not used to navigating how to, locate standards, if you need assistance in knowing where to purchase different standards, or if you just simply have a industry best practice that is widely accepted in your region or with a local municipality and it's not being addressed, you know, where it needs to be, where that comment needs to be put in and how you need to make the citation, and really allowed this meeting to be a working group. So of the people that are on the call, I'd like to kind of pause and find out if anybody on the call has worked on a gap analysis with a different council, if they have any perspective on the gap analysis, if they have contributed to the gap analysis currently here for the AWP and MEWP Council, and if there's any initial questions, just if I haven't been able to explain what the gap analysis is well enough in this initial call, or you don't have any prior knowledge of what a gap analysis is, just take a moment to pause and open it up for questions. So by all means, please speak up and let me know what your experience is with a gaps analysis. Silence is deadly.
Hi, this is Chip.
This is Chris Hughes.
This is who? Hey, Chris.
Hughes.
Hey, Chris, how you doing?
How are you, man? Good.
Great to hear from you.
Thank you. So I probably have done a lot of gap analysis, both as a consultant and even currently with my current employer. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know.
I think we also had Chip. Chip, did you want to say something to the group?
Yeah, hi, I'm Chip Darius. I teach OSHA regulations for the OSHA Training Institute Ed Center, construction and general industry. We do a lot of crossover comparisons between ANSI, ASTM, SAIA, OSHA, et cetera. So I'd be happy to contribute.
Excellent. Thank you, Chip. Any others? Not trying to cut anybody off. Please message in if you want to raise your hand, if you want to say something. By all means, please interrupt me. But I'm going to keep the meeting going. So just a little bit of Q&A. I'm a type of chair that really enjoys interaction. When was the last time that we saw a major update with the aerial work platform regulation cited by OSHA? And are there any major gaps that come to mind if you think about how an MEWP is defined by ANSI or by an international standard? What about OSHA is significantly different than the way that international bodies and ANSI defines an MEWP? Do we have any takers? Chip?
Chip here. The MEWP changeover, OSHA has already issued a letter that says they are not enforcing it, that these changes are above the minimum threshold enforcement that OSHA is going to be doing. So you can make all the thunder and lightning and noise you want at this level, but it's not going to change OSHA enforcement. And OSHA also acknowledges that they are far behind the 8 ball because they intended to have a scaffold, mobile scaffold standard, scissor lift standard, but they failed to materialize that similar to the forklift standard. So they're stuck with enforcing it piecemeal under subpart L.
Well, Chip, I can't thank you enough for articulating exactly what I was hoping was going to get brought up, is that, you know, I think you said it better than what I could. OSHA has taken the stance that they're not going to be enforcing the new standards. They recognize that scissor lifts are still considered scaffolding and that they're not grouped under our AWP standard for 1926.453. Rather, so they are listed under 1926.451, that being for scissor lifts. Boom lifts under 0.453. So I think that's a great beginning to when we're providing a gap analysis where we really need to draw a lot of attention. This would comply very much with goal number 2, which is to bring about issues and elements that have previously been sheltered. And by doing so, I have included in the gap analysis, which you can see up on the screen, where we start with 1926.451. Now it's listed as fall protection because this is done chronologically. But what that is associated to is scissor lifts, and that's the reason that it's really going in there. And for us as the SAIA council to start having discussions, because the industry knows that fall protection is not required in a scissor lift. However, for scaffolding, if you do not have an entry, if you do not have an entryway, or there's a missing guardrail, you do have to have fall protection utilized. And so it's really drawing a connection between, you know, what is the industry saying about fall protection when it comes to scissor lifts, and what is OSHA saying about fall protection in a scissor lift, and trying to draw a connection, and then bring about international standards and the ANSI standard and what their perspective is, laying it all out. And then this will go through a final review with the regulatory committee so that they can go and do their double check after the council's complete with it. And then ultimately it would be brought to the board so that we would, you know, come to a position that we say, you know, this work has been concluded. We've identified these gaps. We have sent it to our regulatory committee for a double check. And we are now of the position that we would like the board to consider presenting this under the OSHA Alliance to the appropriate member within that regulatory body, which would more than likely be our Standards and Compliance Department of OSHA. So with that said, does that spark any thoughts to some of our listeners on just some major gaps that they are already aware of that you would like to bring to the attention so that they're not missed?
Chip here.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Please, Chip.
Thank you. So there's a distinction that has to be drawn between fall protection and ejection protection. And,
Absolutely.
And the OSHA standards are silent on the difference there. And there is also a tendency for people to use a blanket statement like fall protection is not required in a scissor lift, which is only partially true. Fall protection is not required as long as the rails are of adequate height and are in proper position and the user's feet are on the floor and the gate is closed and. So there's a misconception that blanket fall protection is not required in a scissor lift, and that's often an inappropriate conclusion.
Once again, would like to agree with you very much, Chip, and it brings into the question if you have a guardrail height. Although we are not in a position to make interpretations and certainly don't want to ask any of our council members to begin making interpretations, but you bring up a valid point. So we have older pieces of equipment that don't meet the new guardrail height. So does that mean that a recommendation by the council would be to address a piece of a scissor lift equipment that was a 90s or 2000 model that has a lower guardrail height, that they should use fall restraint or fall positioning while they are operating the lift? And what would be the position of fall protection? And that also brings into the question of making sure that the differences between fall protection, fall restraint, and positioning are well defined, and that it's understood in compliance with other leading OSHA regulations for minimum protection.
All great points. It all needs to be clarified. I would like to see an SAIA position statement on that.
What is, and I would hope that we might be able to get somebody other than Chip to chime in here for just a second, but Chip, please don't hesitate to be the answerer. How is ejection protection utilized in scissor lifts and boom lifts?
if nobody else is going to chime in, ejection protection is.
1 second, I think we saw Daniel. Was
Okay.
that correct, Jackie? Did I see Daniel?
Yes, sir. Yeah, this is Daniel Davis. I know for the fall restraint, we require positioning lanyards while we're actually driving, or positioning all boom lifts and scissor lifts, and that's to keep the operator at the controls. It's not used as fall protection. Once they get to the unit to where they're setting up, then they're not required to wear the positioning lanyards.
Only in travel.
Yes, sir.
Which is a good practice, as it's essentially impossible to get any work performed if you are in a restraint or a positioning lanyard inside of a MEWP of any class. So I'd like to, I don't want us to home too much on fall protection because there's so many issues, but I'd like to keep this going just a little bit longer and pose the question, what is a restraint versus a positioning, and how is somebody's company utilizing that or training on it, educating on it? What draws a difference between a restraint lanyard and a positioning lanyard, possibly even referencing an ANSI standard, and what's ANSI's position is on defining those?
Well, Forrest, John Royer here with Action. Typically, like when I'm teaching fall protection, I distinguish the two. Typically work positioning limits the travel distance of no more than 2 feet versus a travel restraint, or what you're calling work restraint, prevents the employee from being able to reach the fall hazard, wherever that may be. So that's where I distinguish between the two.
All right. That, absolutely accurate. I'm going for a number, though. There's a specific number that I'm actually trying to dig out of somebody. Do we have any other takers on what is so significantly different about positioning and restraint?
And it's Chris Hughes. So in my training that I've been doing here in Exelon is having them use, and it really isn't the right device, but it's the best thing on the market right now to use, which is this self-retracting lanyard that is a leading edge with no ripstop. In other words, not to let them travel the 3 foot with the ripstop should they have some kind of an impact or tipping event.
Thank you, Chris. So self-retracting lanyards are very commonly used. You have your twin pack SRL that's on the back of the employee. But then you want to ask yourself, and this is more for discussion. This would be a great example. So let's go to the gap analysis. So we're going to start talking about SRLs. And we would make a reference to a ANSI standard for SRLs and how they limit the fall distance by X. We would want to, and we would begin entering that in here. So I'm just going to kind of make some stuff up. I'm going to say SRL. You would then come to your next line and you would say, 1.1.1 SRL standard with title. Now we would just put in what Chris has described. The reason I'm wanting to use Chris as an example is, Chris, not to home in on you too much, but we have a friendship in addition to a business relationship, so I feel trusting picking on you just a little bit more than I would others. SRLs have specific testing criteria, and the majority of SRLs that are on the market are tested for a downward vertical force and with an association of weight. So a manufacturer may have an SRL that will engage within a matter of a distance of 12 inches, 3 inches, 24 inches. and the manufacturer gives us guidelines. Well, that test is based on 250 pounds of weight falling straight down. When you think of an aerial work platform, you now have an SRL that's connected at a 30 to 45 degree angle. You know, give or take, there's quite a bit of fluctuation on what that angle is. And the question then becomes, was that SRL specifically tested for that type of fall? That's a combination of horizontal and vertical. So is that specific product recommended by the manufacturer to be used into that compliance? And can we reference an ANSI standard when we're speaking to OSHA? So the reason I'm wanting to dig in a little bit deeper is if we're going to be drawing a connection between industry standards and best practices, we can only put them on this document if there's sound testing and guidelines specific to that application. In the fall protection, we probably need to be very careful and move on to a different subject, because there's really not a lot of testing around fall protection inside of aerial work platforms based on the angle of performance. I know that there has been discussions and rumors that there may be some testing that may start coming about, that there's been interest on this subject. But as of to date, there's not a lot of resources that we have to truly understand the effectiveness at those horizontal angles that an AWP puts an SRL in. To go back and to discuss more where I started around restraint, there are specific devices made for MEWPs to restrain an employee, and they require that you be tied off to 2 anchorages, whereas an SRL would be tied off to a single anchorage. The number that I was looking for is, what is the anchorage point rated for? So with now bringing that up and talking about what the anchorage point, where you connect your fall protection to, what is a restraint lanyard anchorage supposed to be rated for versus fall protection, which actually catches an employee in a critical fall? Was anybody, you don't have to have the exact number, but certainly interested if anybody has insight.
Yeah, for restraint purposes, because you're not allowing the fall to occur, it needs to have a safety factor of 4 times whatever the expected load is.
There is a more specific number on to what the anchorage point has to be rated to, and I'm really looking for that. So to dive a little bit deeper, fall protection is 5,000 pounds. What is restraint?
Is it
I believe
200
it's
pounds?
1,800.
1,800 times 2.
So we've answered 2 questions at the same time. Restraint is 1,800. Positioning is 2,700. And your protection is 5,000. So 5,000 is so that if they fall off the ledge, they are caught, and there's no risk of the anchorage breaking, and then that's also based on the employee's weight and so forth. The positioning puts somebody into a area where they're not very mobile, but they have a lot more flexibility than restraint. They can move left to right. They can get around a little bit more, and that creates an opportunity for a slight fall. So the anchorage needs to be rated in that 2,500 range, where I'm just overgeneralizing. Then you go to restraint, which you cannot move. You are actually restrained. And so in that instance, the anchorage can be reduced down to 1,500. Only bringing that up to say, well, what is OSHA's perspective on that stance? What are the anchorage ratings? How are we as an association bringing awareness to knowing that the anchorages are rated for that capacity and that they're being used appropriately in in that application. All of that information would be utilized, being highly specific as you're filling this out. And y'all can see the notes above. Is there any comments based on what I just said? Does that cause any questions or remarks, or does that put you into a thought process where something happened on your job that you would like to share with the group?
Hi, Chip here. Just a thought. Once you start putting codes and standards side by side, you lose sight of the initial assumptions and operating parameters and intent of the standard. So OSHA's intent has always been to be minimum threshold, and there is no problem if you go above that. And depending on the ANSI standards that you're looking at, they may in fact be set forth as minimums like Z359.2, or they may be set forth as specifics like the production standards for hardware under Z359. So it can be somewhat misleading when we start snipping things out of different standards and putting them side by side.
I think that's a great point. And, you know, as a council, once this gets developed a little bit more in depth, you know, if we're speaking about what the gap is, there has to be a conclusion. There has to be a method to what you are trying to achieve and the message that you're trying to transmit to the receiver. And Chip, I just want to, you know, kind of reinforce what you've just brought up and say that you would want to take a look and say, well, what is the minimum, since fall protection's at the top and we've been discussing it, we'll stay on there. What is the minimum fall protection that the industry accepts based on all of the different standards and best practices that we as industry members are aware of? What is the absolute minimum? And then being able to reinforce that through rationale and explain that this is how you go above and beyond. And I would say above and beyond is getting you to the point of, you know, looking at what Chris has said about the utilization of SRLs, how they're being utilized appropriately, what their application is, and having that more as a dialogue and not as the proposed. So with that, Chris, I know that you've shown interest in being able to support the gap analysis. Chip, thank you very much. Daniel, John, do y'all have an interest in, receiving, on a monthly basis, updates on the gap analysis, what comments are being contributed, where the dialogue's going? Is this something you want to be involved with? Are there anybody else on the call that have an interest in this and just want to raise a hand? If you just want to raise a hand and say yes without speaking up, we can make a note. I know that it'll pop up on the screen.
Yeah, I would be interested in being forwarded the information.
All right. Thank you, John.
And I can help in any way that's needed as well.
Thank you, Daniel. Do we have any other takers that would like to get involved with this group? And this isn't like a standard committee where you're required to go through everything and make comments as much as possible. Just what directly affects your work, what you have knowledge in, what you're comfortable speaking on, and just really want to have a good idea of the conclusion of this meeting. Who wants to be receiving these updates and being up to date on the progress that's being made and joining calls if necessary to really talk through that dialogue so that when we move closer to the annual committee, we're able to, as I truly hope, sit down as a group and really work through these more on an action item and less on a presentation of how to perform the gap analysis. All right. Well, I want to thank all of the volunteers very much. We will definitely be adding you to the email chain to make sure that you're staying up to date on this.
Hey, Forrest, this is Steve Smith.
Yes, Steve.
How you doing? Listen, just wanted to say thanks for this. It's obviously a very useful project that that the regulatory committee is very interested in looking at and seeing once you've got it done. Do you have a timetable on when you want to try to have this to regulatory to review?
I would, I'd like to maintain a time frame that's achievable. I would like to be able to be passing it along in November. We definitely need a little bit of time after annual convention. That way, if we have any people that were unable to join this meeting and they're not aware of it or they don't get involved significantly, that we get them at the annual and still have about a month or two following to be able to allow them to contribute and understand what's being said and at least do 1 or 2 phone calls as a group prior to submitting to the regulatory. Is that an acceptable timeline, shooting for November?
That sounds fine. Okay, Jay, just gave me an idea of what we might have coming up. So that sounds great. Nope. And yeah, this is definitely the sort of thing we were looking at for all the councils to come up with, and obviously I think the MEWPs and mass climbers were the 2 main ones that we felt there was a lot of differences between, or gaps, if you like, between the regulations and what actually happens in practice. So
well, let me allow you to kind of steal the floor for a moment. And from your perspective, what brought about that interest and that focus? So that, some of the other people here, it might actually draw a little bit more of their interest and we see more volunteers get involved because of it.
It was basically to do with accidents that have happened over the last few years and then questions that arose during investigations into accidents. And then people started saying, well, yeah, but we do it this way. And then somebody, then some lawyer would dig deep and find some regulation somewhere that said this is the way it has to be done. And then somebody else would say, oh no, but there's another regulation over here that says something different. And so that was really what was what started it all out, as to should we therefore as an organization be looking at some of these gaps between the regulations and what happens in practice, and address them, because if they're obviously looking at what you've got here, there's quite a number. They need to be addressed with the different regulatory bodies to try to eventually, hopefully, try to come up with something that is actually makes sense for the industry to use. And so we've got it. Once we've got this, we've then got to start working closer with the regulatory bodies to explain to them what actually happens in practice, and that what it does happen out there is safe as well. That's the other thing, and safe and practical. So yeah, so that's what started all out, and I think and so it's great to see that we've got some action on this and movement on it. So thanks.
Well, thank you very much for you definitely lit a fire at the last meeting to make sure that this was being worked on. So we wanted to make sure that it was. So to what you just discussed, I think I have to make everybody on the call aware that really then our focus, based on why this was turned into a project, is that there would be 5 items we would want to focus on in the gap analysis. And those would be our top 5 injuries. So our number 1 is electrocutions. So how is OSHA's minimum requirements for electrocution being appropriately addressed, and how are industry standards doing a better job? The number 2 would be falls from aerial lifts. So that directly correlates with fall protection, what the scaffolding standard says that covers scissor lifts versus what the 0.453 standard says for booms. And, drawing that gap analysis around how the increase to the minimum would create less falls from aerial lifts. The third is, how does this gap analysis bring attention to aerial lift tip overs? And how has that issue been addressed? And has OSHA adequately talked about ground conditions? I think that one of the most significant changes that we saw in the suite of standards, really brought about by a few of our key industry friends, some of the people out of the international bodies that do a significant amount of work with the ISO standard writing, really brought about supervisor training and education around operator training. And I think that that level of focus on what a supervisor needs to be aware of really did bring a lot of attention to how you can control aerial lift tip overs that are typically operator or poor job condition issues that could have been eliminated through a pre-task assessment, understanding the weight of that platform, having knowledge about the conditions, understanding how to use the manufacturer's operations manual, how to read the operations manual, how to be familiar with the manufacturer's operation manual. All of the data is there. And will this gap analysis be able to draw attention to, you know, just saying that there needs to be more focus and there needs to be more education around utilizing that operator's manual so that you understand the conditions of the aerial lift to avoid tip overs. A industry issue that's been self-correcting rather rapidly because of some of the innovations brought into the industry is caught in between, getting caught between the lift and an object. And how would we address that? And then being struck by objects outside of the basket. So currently these are the top 5 injuries. And just to reiterate that, and with a follow-up email, I'll definitely send this out to everybody, is electrocutions, falls from aerial lift tip overs, getting caught between the lift and an object, and being struck by an object outside of the bucket. And Steve, you know, if open your mic back up, is that really the intent of what you're looking for, addressing major key issues in the gap analysis so that we have an action plan when presenting in the OSHA Alliance?
Correct. Yes.
Very good. Well, thank you.
What we're looking for. Yeah.
On the electrocution risk, there is something that even OSHA is way behind on knowledge and understanding of, which is induction risk. You don't necessarily have to be in the mat in order for an aerial lift to become conductive through electromagnetic, especially if you're using that lift in any kind of situation where you're near transmission lines. Okay, when you're in 230 kV, the field is like much further than what they have on their minimum approaches.
That's a great point. So would that be drawing a connection between, you know, a lift defined by the ANSI A92.2 versus a lift that is defined by currently ANSI A92.6 or 0.5 later to be combined under the 0.20, 0.22, and 0.24, which will move to the classification of 3B plus, saying that, you know, you have your bucket truck versus your boom lift, and those approach distances are different because it has a perception of its application in the industry. Chris, how would you define that? I got a little wordy with that. So how would you go about talking about it?
When you look at most of your bucket trucks, right? So the bucket and a portion of the boom are the non-dielectric material. But there is a lot of times that either a scissor lift or a boom lift is used inside, say, a substation. Okay, so you get into mobile equipment grounding, and then you also still have a secondary grounding scheme that needs to be developed and recognized for the basket itself, because when you start handling material, the more material put in the air, the greater the induction risk. And that's one of the things. It is sort of covered under IEEE, but there's still a lot of, for lack of a better word, tribal knowledge with a lot of older guys. It's never really been put on paper as far as mobile equipment grounding scheme, and especially using scissor lifts and aerial lifts inside like substations. And even sometimes they'll use the big like 185s out on the right of way when they're doing transmission work. So it's something that needs to be addressed, because
I think, Chris, you're bringing up a really significant point, because when you're talking about the grounding, things change, and we'd have to really rely on some expertise. I think that we have a good friend, Mr. Jeff Juergens from AEM, with us, and perhaps there's an ability to have somebody from the AEM community that would be able to kind of speak and address issues when it comes towards the applicability of bonding and what the manufacturers are looking for in that situation, because the equipment has its limitations itself. And so we'll open the floor, and maybe there is the ability to have some of our good friends from AEM get involved, so that the perspective of the manufacturers is reinforced as we go through and we provide this content.
This is Jeff Forrest. I'm just here to find out about what you do in your council, and just get up to speed with what's going on. I don't know that I'm in right now to give you a hand.
Well, thank you for joining us very much, and you will definitely be looking towards the manufacturer's insights for this. But all the same, it's excellent to have you on the phone with us, as the manufacturing community is, really the reason that we have something to support and be passionate about, because of the innovation y'all bring to the community. So, but thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
But Chris, I think and those are the perspectives I'm looking for. So I know that you brought up that it's tribal knowledge, but is there any written documentation you think that you could put into the format of this gap analysis and draw a connection to that tribal knowledge and how it's been addressed, or if there's interpretation letters that have been issued on that specific subject that could be brought to attention, if there's written documentation on how to comply with that, because that is a major issue. I mean, electrocutions is a tricky one, with a pretense that a lot of our electrocutions are happening out of the tree industry, which brings us back to reinforcing training of the employees, and that the employers have a responsibility to training. Exelon is a...
Well, one of the things too that we kind of been pressing, and especially with the rash of electrocutions that have actually happened here in the Washington, D.C. area, is the fact that rubber cover-up from an electrical event that happened, we did not put the rubber up. But to be clear, guys, so when you put rubber on a 13 kV circuit, there is still 1,000 volts on the outside of the skin. And there is this misconception that rubber cover-up is, the best alternative to being able to work near power lines, and it's not. And as far as the tribal knowledge, there is some work in IEEE for mobile equipment grounding, but I know at least two guys in my company. One of them has got 38 years in the business and is about to retire, and he is extremely gifted in grounding. That's one guy in a staff of 5. So I'd like to try and get him to help participate in some of that if he's interested.
That would be great.
Yeah, we use a lot of man lifts and boom lifts inside substations to build new buses. And there is an incredibly strong induction risk. And, a lot of people just assuming when they go look at the power line, oh, everything's 13 kV. No. Depending on where you are and the location, some people may be walking into the trap. If you don't know how to do the insulator count, you could literally be staring at a pole that has 4 concentric 13 kV a 34, and then the top series of conductors is 69. So again, it's pushing out the approach distance that you have to stay away from, right? So OSHA would say if on 13 you have to stay 10 foot away, 69 you have to be 20. That's great, but then there's what most people forget about on induction is if it's a humid day, if there's rain, there's numerous factors that play into this as well.
So I think that really brings us back. That brings us right back to where, you know, we kind of started and a comment brought up by Chip, which was, you know, OSHA's perspective is what is the minimum? And the question would be, with knowledge that we have, is it meaningful to try to ask for an increase of that minimum, or to bring attention that that minimum approach distance, which is listed at 10 feet, should be 20, or should there be additional language more specific to the equipment? And once again, just homing in on this as an example, as you go through it, do not hold back in what your thoughts are, your rationales, what you're wanting to propose. Do not by any means hold back on that. But be mindful that the intent and the final receiver is intended to be OSHA, and their perspective is minimum before you get penalized, not best practice.
Right. And the problem is that if you look at a lot of anything where you're approaching on power lines, they will automatically default to the utility. The utility has the final say, and you have to have a utility engineer involved. But the problem is most people are afraid to pick up the phone and call the utility because they're afraid they're not going to be able to do their job. And it happens regularly.
Yeah, and that's one of those industry issues that will take a culture change, but we certainly are here to push for that. Well, we're about 13 minutes away from the end of the hour, and I really want to make sure that, you know, this was utilized as a working meeting. We found some volunteers that haven't previously been identified to contribute to this gap analysis. Please raise a hand, open up your mic, speak up. It doesn't have to be about the gap analysis. If you would like to take a time and ask questions, if you're aware of some industry issues that have happened and that you just really feel that you need to bring up and share as a best practice with other people, I'd like to open up the floor at this time so that we can take in those questions and respond. Chip? Chip, go ahead, please.
I'd like to raise the issue of power line proximity detection on scissor lifts and boom lifts. Obviously, that
is a very good one. What about proximity detection are you interested in? I've personally been working on this as an initiative within my company and trying to bring some markets and make them available. So I'm curious, what about that has your attention?
I'm a safety guy, almost 30 years, retained as an expert witness on multiple cases. A number of them involve electrocutions for scissor lift and boom lift. Some are in the basket and some are on the ground. So we have an industry-wide problem of either people in baskets or baskets without people coming too close to power lines with no warning except the user looking out for the line. So the question is, how can we reliably have technology that's going to warn the user either in the basket or from the ground as the basket approaches so that the machine is smarter than the user and stops the movement?
Well, the one key factor when you're addressing technology of that type is that you're going to have to interface with the equipment in the means of an interlock. Do you have experiences with interlocks, installing interlocks, and really getting into the backbone of the the computing system. You know, you've run into SCADA programs and everything else with that interlock, and so now you're really tapping into the manufacturer's technology. Have you had experience implementing a interlock through power detection?
I have not personally. There was a proposal with the new crane standard that OSHA would recognize proximity detection, and then that was pulled back because the technology was not reliable. I'm just raising it as an issue for us as an industry because we have a consistent pattern.
I agree. And that also, it just, I will make a note because I fully agree that there's great opportunities there. But there's some other leading issues that you are going to have to become involved with the interlock of the machinery. And that brings up a whole new set of issues in our industry currently. Any other thoughts? We're now about 9 minutes to the top of the hour. Well, I would have to say if we don't have any questions, that's a good Chip. Go ahead. The floor is yours, Chip.
Yep. Over the unmute button got hidden behind a thing. There's another issue with the upcoming revisions to the A92 standards and OSHA's rewrite of Subpart D, eliminating chains as fall protection. We're starting to see people in the field who are taking a bolt-on self-closing swing gate, which is designed for use in a facility, and they're retrofitting or they're mounting that gate on a scissor lift without the manufacturer's permission or authorization. So that provides a top rail substitute and a mid rail substitute, but no toe board. And the industry should be looking at retrofit kits for older equipment to accommodate all three, top rail, mid rail, toe board retrofits.
Retrofit kits. Well, I'd say very good. OSHA's stance, just historically, you know, they're going to take a look at the older equipment that was installed with a chain, and you know, I don't see, but I don't want my opinion to deter from this as a work group. But I don't know that OSHA's stance would be that, you know, all equipment retroactively needs to be remodeled if it did have a chain. And maybe perhaps even open up the floor if anybody has thoughts on the thought of you have a chain installed on a scissor lift. Should it be updated to have a swing gate that has the toe guard installed on the bottom? Because it is a good point. It is a good issue. Well, I see no hands raised, Chip. I'm going to definitely make a note of that. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to get my mic turned on there. Took me a second. In other standards across the various ANSI committees, retrofitting is something that's covered under. It doesn't have to be done until the machine is reconditioned, if you will. And then once the reconditioning happens, then it has to meet the standard of that time frame. So for instance, if a machine was manufactured 10 years ago and the standard changed 5 years ago, I don't necessarily have to retrofit that machine until I go through a reconditioning or some sort of, you know, reconstruction, if you will, rebuilding, if you will. But once I do an official rebuilding in the maintenance records, then I am required to update it to that current standard. So I don't know if that's something you guys want to look at or not.
Would you be willing to send me an email with some of the citations and kind of dig a little bit deeper into that, and then I'll be able to take that information and submit to all of the other people that are working on the project as well? Is that something you'd be willing to do?
Sure.
I appreciate it.
Is Is that Forrest that's speaking? I'm sorry, my screen's not showing.
It is. It's Forrest.
Okay.
And
Okay, Forrest,
my
no problem.
email, I'll make sure that my email gets out. But if you have pen and paper, it is
Sure, go ahead.
Hester, FHESTER @Tutus, TUTUS.com. It's pronounced Tutus, not tutus, but there is a bit of irony in that word. Tutus
Gotcha.
is the Latin word for safe, but
Right.
there you go. We all learn something new every day.
All right.
Well, we are 5 minutes out. If there is no additional comments, I cannot thank everybody enough for joining us, taking a look at this gap analysis that the AWP and MEWP Council is going to be taking on. And we'll certainly be reaching out to all stakeholders and relying on our co-chair as well to tap into his network so that we may get as much insight as possible as we present this to our regulatory committee for review, and hopefully have something for submission in 2021 to our board as a presentation, which would be an outstanding amount of progress. Well, thank you everybody very much for joining me. I hope y'all have a great time, and I look forward to seeing y'all here in about 2 hours, correct? 6 o'clock is the mixer. Is that right, Jackie and
It's just right.
Brandy?
It's just right after the next
Ask
session.
climate.
Immediately following. So it'll be probably around 5 o'clock.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
Maybe even 10 past 5 or 10 past 4.
There you go.
Everybody,
Perfect.
Thank you, Forrest. Good session. We'll begin the mass climbing council meeting in about 4 minutes. So everybody just hang tight.